When I stepped into the courtroom, the air felt thick with tension, like a storm about to break. My daughter and her husband were laughing softly, their heads close together in some private joke. They didn't notice me at all, didn't hear the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the worn linoleum floor. To them, I had ceased to exist long ago. I was just an old man, a burdensome relic cluttering up their lives, hogging an extra room in their apartment and stubbornly refusing to die. They had dragged me here, filing a lawsuit to declare me incompetent, to strip away the last shreds of independence I had left, the keys to my old apartment, perhaps even my meager savings. It was their final play to erase me completely. But then the judge looked up from his papers, his eyes locking onto mine across the room. His face drained of color, turning as pale as a ghost's. His hands trembled visibly, the gavel slipping slightly in his grip. His voice cracked, barely above a whisper, yet it echoed through the silent hall. "My God, it's really you!" Everyone turned, the murmurs dying instantly. My daughter stopped laughing mid-breath. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger for the first time, her eyes widening in confusion and dawning realization. And in that moment, the truth I'd buried for 30 long years began to unravel, a secret I'd kept not out of shame, but because I believed true love needed no proof, no grand gestures to validate it. Before we dive deeper into this tale, if you're enjoying the story so far, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're tuning in from. Your support means the world and keeps these stories coming. All right, let's get back to it. Viktor Stepanovich Gromov awoke at precisely 5 a.m., just as he had every single day for the past 40 years. It was a habit forged in the fires of discipline, first by the army, where reveille yanked you from sleep before the sun dared to peek over the horizon, and later by the quiet demands of caring for his ailing wife. Back then, he'd rise in the pitch-black hours to prepare her breakfast, measure out her medications, and ensure everything was ready before her eyelids fluttered open. Ludmila had been gone for 12 years now, claimed by the relentless march of illness, but his body hadn't forgotten. Each morning, without fail, his eyes snapped open at that ungodly hour. He'd lie there for a few seconds, staring at the unfamiliar cracks in the ceiling, piecing together his reality. This wasn't his home anymore. He was in the cramped spare room of his daughter's apartment, a place he'd moved into 6 months earlier. Marina had convinced him with soft words and feigned concern. "Dad, I'm worried about your health. Come live with us so we can keep an eye on you." He'd believed her, wanted to believe her. Gathering his few belongings, he'd left his own modest apartment standing empty, dust gathering on the furniture like forgotten memories. He thought it was a chance for them to grow closer, to mend the invisible rifts that had widened over the years. Now, in the cold light of hindsight, he saw it for what it was, the first step in a calculated plan. That naive hope had become his most painful mistake, a wound that festered deeper than any physical ache. Viktor eased himself out of bed with deliberate slowness, mindful not to let the ancient springs creak under his weight. He'd memorized every inch of this apartment in the short time he'd been here. The floorboards that groaned like old bones underfoot, the ones that stayed silent as a secret. He moved like a shadow in the pre-dawn gloom, a ghost in his own life. It hadn't always been this way, but one morning he overheard his son-in-law, Oleg, complaining loudly enough for the words to seep through the thin walls. "Your father shuffles around the apartment at 6 in the morning. I can't get a decent night's sleep before work. Do something about it." Marina came to him later that day, her gaze fixed on the floor as she murmured, "Please, Dad, try not to leave your room before 8. He hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice. He just nodded, swallowing the bitterness like a pill. Dressing in the dim light filtering through the curtains, he pulled on his faded trousers and the shirt he'd worn back in his days as a legal consultant at the factory, a garment long out of fashion, its collar frayed from years of wear. What was the point of buying new clothes? Who was he trying to impress? His outings were limited to quick trips to the corner store for groceries, and even those he timed for when Marina and Oleg were out, sparing himself their nitpicking remarks. Why did you buy that cheap butter again? And this bread, it's practically stale. By 5:30, Viktor couldn't wait any longer. He slipped out of his room and padded to the kitchen, his steps as light as whispers. All he craved was a simple cup of black tea, the same ritual he'd upheld for 50 years, first from a battered tin mug in the army barracks, then from his cherished ceramic cup with its chipped handle at home. Marina had tossed that cup during the move, dismissing it as junk we don't need. Now he used one from Oleg's pristine set, always the same plain white one, careful not to encroach on theirs. He set the kettle on the stove, twisting the gas knob to its lowest setting so the whistle wouldn't pierce the silence like a siren. As the water heated with a gentle hum, Viktor stood by the window, gazing out at the awakening city. It was early October, and dawn was lazy these days, the sky still cloaked in velvet darkness. Street lamps cast golden pools on the pavement, and the occasional car hummed by, its headlights cutting through the chill. In the distance, the first commuter train let out a mournful wail, echoing his unspoken loneliness. His mind wandered back 30 years, to another window in his old apartment where he'd stood watching a similar sunrise. In his arms, he'd cradled little Marina, who fussed and cried from teething pains. Ludmila had been exhausted, collapsing into bed after long nights, so Viktor took over the midnight shifts. He'd pace the room with his daughter, humming tuneless lullabies until her whimpers faded into sleep. Those moments were pure, unadulterated joy, the weight of her tiny body against his chest, her small fingers clutching his shirt. Marina, of course, remembered none of it. How could she? She was just a baby then, innocent and unaware of the sacrifices woven into the fabric of her life. But Viktor remembered every detail, every sleepless night, every whispered promise to protect her forever. And now, here he was, reduced to an intruder in her world, his love repaid with indifference and schemes. She barely remembered anything from her childhood, and she never bothered to ask. The kettle began to hiss softly, a gentle warning before its full-throated whistle could erupt. Viktor quickly lifted it off the flame, silencing it before it could disturb the household. He steeped his tea in the quiet steam and fished a stale slice of bread from the bread box, the remnants of last night's dinner. Settling into the small table tucked in the farthest corner of the kitchen, he chose this spot deliberately. It was the most secluded, granting him a precious few extra seconds if someone entered unexpectedly. Seconds to finish his meager meal, gulp down his tea, rise and retreat to his room, without imposing, without irritating anyone with his mere existence. He hadn't even managed 3 sips when Oleg appeared in the doorway, his son-in-law disheveled in a rumpled robe, his face creased from sleep, eyes heavy with resentment of a man rudely awakened. No greeting passed between them. Oleg brushed past Viktor as if he were invisible, yanking open the refrigerator door with a resounding slam that rattled the shelves, as though trying to wrench it free from its hinges. Viktor stared fixedly into his cup, willing himself to shrink, to occupy as little space as possible. In his army days, he'd commanded platoons with iron authority. In the courtroom, he'd handed down verdicts that shaped lives and destinies. Yet here, in his own daughter's home, he trained himself to breathe shallowly, to fade into the background like forgotten wallpaper.
Oleg snorted, his skepticism etched in every line of his face. He pulled out his phone, jabbed at the screen, and pressed it to his ear. Someone picked up on the other end, and Oleg launched into conversation, turning his back to Viktor as if dismissing him from reality altogether. "Yeah, everything's on track," he said, his tone brisk and businesslike. "We're filing next week. Got the certificate already. The doctor wrote it up just right. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Soon we'll be living like normal people again." Viktor froze, his cup hovering midway to his lips. His hand trembled, spilling a few dark drops onto the tablecloth. He stared at Oleg's back, a chill seeping into his chest like icy fingers wrapping around his heart. He'd known for a while that Marina and Oleg resented his presence, that he was a burden weighing them down. But hearing it laid out like this, in a casual, transactional phone call, as if he were an outdated piece of furniture to be disposed of, hit differently, a gut punch that left him breathless. Oleg wrapped up the call, shoved the phone into his robe pocket, and strode out without so much as a glance back. Viktor remained seated, gazing at his now cold tea, the bread turning to a dry, unappetizing crust in his hand. He pieced together the fragments. Certificate, filing, he doesn't suspect a thing. What scheme had they hatched? He lingered at the table until 8 a.m., long after his breakfast had lost all appeal, listening to the morning routines unfold around him. The shower ran as Oleg prepared for the day. Marina stirred in the bedroom, her voice mingling with his in muffled exchanges. Then the front door slammed as Oleg departed for work, leaving the apartment shrouded in an uneasy silence. Marina emerged around 9, already dressed impeccably, makeup flawless, poised for whatever errands or meetings awaited her. She worked remotely as a financial consultant, often dashing out for client appointments, which left Viktor alone in the echoing space. Once she'd cherished those solitary hours, chances to venture beyond his room without feeling like an intruder. But now, after overhearing Oleg's conversation, the quiet felt hostile, pregnant with unspoken threats. Marina busied herself with the coffee machine, a sleek gadget Viktor had never mastered, its buttons and settings a mystery to him. She poured herself a steaming mug without offering him any, though she couldn't have missed his empty cup on the table. It wasn't malice, he told himself, just oversight. He'd become part of the furniture, an old cabinet that took up space but went unnoticed until it got in the way. "Dad," she said, startling at the sound of her voice, breaking his stillness. "I need to talk to you." She sat across from him, but her eyes avoided his, flicking instead to his hands, the tabletop, the cooling dregs in his cup, anywhere but his face. It was a habit from her childhood, that averted gaze, whenever she'd fib about unfinished homework or pilfered coins from his wallet. "Dad, Oleg and I have discussed everything. You understand, right? We're worried about you. You're not young anymore. Your health isn't what it used to be. You forget things sometimes, mix up the days. We just want to take care of you, properly." Viktor said nothing, waiting for the hammer to fall. Marina sipped her coffee, steeling herself. "We want to formalize guardianship," she said at last, the words tumbling out. "It's for your own good. That way we can manage your finances, your health decisions. You're struggling on your own. Remember last month when you left the gas on? Or when you lost your apartment keys? The doctor says it's normal at your age, but you need supervision." Viktor remembered the gas incident all too well. He hadn't forgotten to turn it off. He'd started cooking lunch, only for Oleg to barge in and berate him for using the stove without permission. Humiliated, Viktor had retreated to his room, and Marina had eventually shut it off herself, assuming her father had slipped up again. As for the keys, he hadn't lost them. They'd been tucked in the pocket of his old jacket, right where he'd placed them, and then overlooked. But arguing felt futile, like shouting into a void. "Guardianship," Viktor echoed, his voice flat, almost devoid of inflection.
"Yes," Marina nodded, her relief palpable, as if she'd braced for an outburst or argument that never came. It was just a formality, a piece of paper. Nothing would really change. You'd still live here with us. We'd take care of you, just officially now. But what about my apartment? The question caught her off guard, hanging in the air like an unexpected shadow. She hadn't anticipated it. Her carefully rehearsed script derailed. Viktor's apartment, the one where he'd lived for 40 years, where Marina herself had been born, where Ludmila had drawn her last breath, now stood empty, a silent sentinel to his past. He hadn't sold it or rented it out. He'd simply left it as is, like preserving a cherished relic, holding on to the faint hope of returning one day. "We've thought about that," Marina said, her voice shifting to a softer, more persuasive tone, the kind one uses to coax a reluctant child. "It might make sense to sell it. You don't need 2 places, Dad, and the money could go toward your care, doctors, medications. You know how expensive healthcare is these days." Viktor gazed at his daughter, searching her face for traces of the girl he once knew, trying to pinpoint when she'd transformed into this stranger. Little Marinashka, who begged for bedtime stories read 3 times in a row, who wailed inconsolably whenever he left on business trips. The child who'd burst through the door with a gleeful "Papa" and flung herself into his arms, wrapping her small limbs around his neck like a lifeline. The teenager who'd come home beaming with an A on her school essay titled "My Hero," and when he'd asked who it was about, she'd blushed and mumbled, "You, Dad." Where had that girl gone? At what invisible crossroads had she evolved into this poised woman sitting across from him, calmly rationalizing why he should relinquish his home? Viktor knew, deep down, that he bore some responsibility for this disconnect. He'd never shared his past with her, not the gritty details of his years in military justice, the high-stakes cases he'd presided over, the verdicts that had altered lives forever. When Ludmila fell ill, he'd resigned from his position without a second thought, burying that chapter of his life. To Marina, he'd always been just a humble legal consultant at the factory, a nondescript man with a modest salary and no grand ambitions. Oleg had only reinforced that image, his snide remarks filtering through the walls more times than Viktor cared to count. "My father had 3 apartments by his age, but yours? He just sat around collecting pennies." Viktor had never defended himself, never boasted. He believed a real man didn't flaunt his achievements, that his daughter should love him for who he was, not for the medals and commendations gathering dust in an old briefcase on the top shelf. For 30 years he'd held his silence, and now that reticence had turned against him like a double-edged sword. "I need to think about it," he said simply. Marina's brow furrowed, a flicker of impatience crossing her features. She disliked deviations from her plans, loose ends that refused to tie neatly. "Dad, what's there to think about? It's for your own good. We're not strangers. I'm your daughter." "That's exactly why I need to think," Viktor replied evenly, rising from the table. He retreated to his room, closing the door with a soft click that echoed louder in his mind than any slam. Sinking onto the bed, he felt his heart pounding in erratic rhythm, faster than it should for a man his age. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, more elusive. Hurt, disillusionment, perhaps a cocktail of both. He'd grown unaccustomed to naming his emotions, having bottled them up for so long they felt foreign, like relics from another life. He remained sequestered in his room until evening, foregoing lunch, ignoring the gnawing hunger in his stomach. Marina had left for some appointment, her car pulling away with a faint rumble. Oleg returned from work, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. They dined together in the living room, their voices drifting through the thin walls in fragmented snippets. "Did he agree?" Oleg asked, his tone laced with anticipation. "He said he'll think about it." "What's there to think about? The old man's losing it. You can see that. We need to move faster before he starts fighting back." "Maybe he's scared. It's a big step." "He has nothing to fear. We're not monsters. We'll file the papers, sell the apartment, all above board. Then we can send him somewhere with proper care. There are good nursing homes out there." "Nursing homes? Oleg, we never discussed nursing homes." "What did you expect? That he'd live with us forever? Marina, I can't take it anymore. He shuffles around at dawn, reeks of that old man smell, stares at us with those pathetic eyes. I want a normal life. I want to come home without seeing his miserable face." Marina fell silent. Viktor waited, His breath held, hoping, praying she'd push back, defend him, remind her father that this was her father, the man who raised her single-handedly for 30 years after her mother's death, who gifted her his own apartment on her 25th birthday as a symbol of his unwavering devotion. But the silence stretched on, unbroken, more damning than any accusation. Slowly, Viktor rose from the bed, his knees protesting with sharp twinges, a nightly ritual in these later years. He approached the wardrobe, reaching up to the highest shelf to retrieve his old army briefcase, the one he'd carried to duty 40 years ago. Crafted from rugged leather, worn smooth at the corners, its brass clasp dulled with time, it felt like an extension of himself.
He settled back on the bed, placing the briefcase on his lap and flicking open the latch. Inside lay documents untouched for decades. His military ID with classified notations, his credentials as a judge in the military tribunal, commendations signed by the Minister of Defense himself. There was the order he'd received for standing firm against undue pressure, refusing to deliver an unjust verdict. A photograph, too, a younger Viktor in his colonel's uniform, flanked by figures whose faces now graced national news as pillars of the judicial system. At the bottom, a letter. Viktor unfolded it carefully, though he knew every word by heart. For demonstrated integrity and resistance to improper influence in case number redacted, recommended for a government award and promotion to chairman of the district military court. He'd never taken that post. A week after the letter arrived, Ludmila's diagnosis shattered their world, and Viktor had submitted his resignation that very day, without hesitation, without regret. Family had always trumped career in his book, and now that same family sought to deem him incompetent, to seize the remnants of his life. He lingered over a photo of Ludmila, tucked among the papers, her smile radiant, youthful, untouched by the ravages of illness. He recalled her words, whispered near the end. "Tell Marinushka about yourself. She needs to know what kind of father she has. She'd be so proud." He'd brushed it off then, insisting there was time, that he didn't want to brag, that love wasn't quantified by accolades. "Lucia," he murmured into the dim room, his voice barely audible. "I think I was wrong." He reached for his phone, an outdated flip model that Marina and Oleg had foisted on him, claiming a smartphone would be too complicated. You wouldn't figure it out anyway, they'd said. Viktor hadn't argued, though he was perfectly adept with technology, having navigated far more complex systems in his heyday. He flipped through the pages of his address book until he found the name he was looking for. Pavel Andreyevich Sokolov, his old friend and comrade in arms, the only person from his past life with whom he'd maintained any semblance of contact, though he hadn't called him in at least 5 years. Viktor glanced at the clock. It was 10:30 at night, too late for a phone call by any reasonable standard, but an insistent intuition told him that waiting wasn't an option. He pressed the dial button. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a click in a familiar voice answered, barely altered by the passage of years. "Hello, Pavel Andreyevich?" Viktor said, his own voice sounding distant and unfamiliar in his ears. "This is Gromov. Viktor Gromov? Do you remember me?" A pause stretched on the other end, followed by a sharp exhale, and then the voice crackled with emotion. "Vitya? Gromov? My God, I thought you were dead. You've been off the radar for so long. No calls, nothing? What happened? Are you all right?" "No," Viktor replied flatly. "Things aren't all right at all. I need your help. For the first time in 30 years, Pasha, I'm asking." The next morning, Viktor left the apartment at precisely 9 a.m., timing his exit for after Oleg had departed for work and Marina had sequestered herself in the bedroom with her laptop. He donned his best coat, the one he'd bought with Ludmila 15 years ago at the department store on Tverskaya Street. It was a bit threadbare now, but still held its shape, a relic of better days. Paired with it were his old shoes, polished to a mirror shine. The habit of meticulous footwear care had stuck with him from his army days, when an officer's character could be judged by the state of his boots.
His daughter didn't inquire about his plans as he prepared to leave. She rarely did anymore, her curiosity about his comings and goings having faded long ago. Viktor left a note on the kitchen table anyway. Out on errands, back by lunch. He wasn't sure if anyone would bother to read it, but propriety demanded it. 30 years of military service had instilled in him an unyielding sense of order, even in the smallest details, a discipline that extended to everything from folding his clothes to leaving messages, no matter how insignificant they might seem. The city greeted him with a brisk October wind that carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, whipping through the streets like an unwelcome reminder of autumn's decay. Viktor walked slowly along the familiar avenue, one he'd known since childhood, reflecting on how profoundly everything had transformed around him. Once, this neighborhood had been dotted with quaint wooden houses, adorned with intricate carved window frames, their charm evoking a bygone era. Then came the demolitions, replaced by drab concrete 5-story blocks that loomed like sentinels of Soviet efficiency. Now even those had given way to sleek glass towers, housing luxury apartments that gleamed under the overcast sky, symbols of a new, affluent world he barely recognized. Only he remained unchanged, a man out of time, anchored to memories of a reality that no longer existed. The cafe where he'd arranged to meet Pavel was nestled in the city center, housed in an old merchant's building that had miraculously survived the waves of urban redevelopment. Viktor had chosen it deliberately. 40 years ago, he and Pavel had been regulars there after long days at work, nursing shots of cognac and dissecting cases that couldn't be discussed with anyone else, sensitive matters of justice and morality that demanded discretion. Back then it was a no-frills spot, with plastic tables, greasy menus, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Now it had evolved into a trendy establishment, boasting author's cuisine and prices that made Viktor's heart clench in protest. But today he could afford a simple cup of coffee. Today it mattered. Pavel was already there, seated at a table by the window, his presence unmistakable despite the years. Viktor recognized him instantly, though time had left its marks. Pavel had gained weight, his hair had turned silver, and he sported stylish glasses perched on his nose, complemented by an expensive suit that spoke of success and stability. But his eyes, those sharp, penetrating eyes, remained the same, the eyes of a man accustomed to peering into the souls of others, discerning truth from deception with effortless precision. Pavel stood as Viktor approached, staring at him for a long moment as if questioning the reality before him. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and enveloped Viktor in a bear hug, the kind reserved for lifelong friends who would resign themselves to never crossing paths again. "Vitya," Pavel rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "Damn it, Vitya, I really thought you were gone. Why didn't you call all these years? Why vanish like that?" Viktor gently extricated himself from the embrace and took his seat across the table. He wasn't one for public displays of affection, even among old comrades, a restraint forged in the rigid hierarchies of the military, where emotions were viewed as vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities were luxuries no officer in his position could afford. "Lucia got sick," he explained simply, the words carrying the weight of unspoken grief. "Then she passed. After that, it was all about raising Marinishka. Work, home, responsibilities piling up. You know how it goes. Time slips away, and before you realize it, 20 years have vanished, and you haven't picked up the phone." Pavel nodded solemnly, his expression one of shared understanding. He'd endured his own trials, burying his parents, then his wife. Life had a way of prioritizing losses and duties over friendships, eroding connections until they felt like distant echoes. The waiter arrived with their coffees and discreetly withdrew, sensing the gravity of the conversation and the need for privacy. Viktor took a sip and winced slightly. The brew was too strong, too bitter, a far cry from the mild tea he preferred at home. But the taste was irrelevant now. "Tell me,"
Pavel urged, leaning forward. "What happened? On the phone you said you needed help. In 40 years of knowing you, I've never once heard you ask for it, not even a whisper." Viktor reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded sheet of paper, placing it on the table before Pavel. His friend unfolded it carefully and began to read, his face darkening with each line, shifting from curiosity to furrowed disbelief. "This is a court summons," Pavel said, at last, his voice laced with incredulity. "A lawsuit to declare you incompetent. And the plaintiffs? Your daughter and her husband?" Viktor nodded grimly. "They want to have me declared unfit. Me." Pavel set the papers aside and stared at his friend as if he'd just claimed the impossible, like insisting the earth was flat in an age of satellites. "Vitya, you presided over cases that made generals quake in their boots. You delivered verdicts under pressure from the highest echelons, standing your ground when it could have cost you everything. You refused to convict an innocent man, even when it threatened your career and your safety. And now your own daughter wants to strip you of your autonomy? Does she even know who you are?" "She doesn't know," Viktor admitted quietly, his gaze dropping to the table. "To her, I've always been just a lowly clerk at the factory, scraping by on pennies, a gray, unambitious failure with nothing to show for his life." Pavel leaned back in his chair, absorbing the revelation in stunned silence for several seconds. "Why?" he asked finally, his tone a mix of bewilderment and frustration. "Why keep it hidden? You're a hero, Vitya."
"A real hero," Pavel continued, his voice laced with a mix of admiration and exasperation. "Not the kind they glorify in movies with dramatic music and slow-motion heroics. You saved dozens of lives from wrongful convictions, putting your own career, your freedom, even your life on the line time and again. You stood up to pressures that would have broken lesser men. So why on earth doesn't your daughter know any of this? Why keep it all buried like some forgotten artifact?" Viktor fell silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the window where pedestrians hurried by, bundled against the autumn chill, each absorbed in their own worlds, briefcases swinging, phones pressed to ears, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding inside the cafe. How could he explain something that had seemed so self-evident throughout his entire life? How to articulate the deep-seated belief that any mention of his own accomplishments smacked of vanity, of unseemly boasting? He'd always held firm to the conviction that true merit didn't need fanfare, that genuine love, from a child, a spouse, or anyone, shouldn't hinge on a ledger of medals and commendations. It was a code he'd lived by, forged in the fires of military discipline and judicial integrity, where actions spoke louder than words ever could. "I thought it didn't matter," he said at last, his words measured and heavy with regret. "I figured a daughter should love her father just for being there, not because of some dusty awards or official letters of gratitude. Lyusia, God rest her soul, used to tell me I was wrong about that. Right up until the end, she'd urge me to sit down with Marinishka and share the stories, to let her see the man behind the quiet facade. I promised her I would, but I never got around to it. There always seemed to be more time, tomorrow, next week, when she'd ask on her own. But she never did ask, and I didn't want to force it on her. I didn't want to come across as some old fool patting himself on the back." Pavel leaned forward, his coffee forgotten as he studied his old friend's face, etched with the lines of years and unspoken burdens. "And now, what's their endgame here?" Viktor recounted the overheard conversation in painstaking detail, the hushed tones filtering through the walls, the casual cruelty in Oleg's words about guardianship, selling the apartment and shipping him off to a nursing home like an unwanted heirloom. He spared no nuance, Marina's hesitant silences, Oleg's impatient dismissals, the way the plan unfolded like a well-rehearsed script designed to strip him of everything but his memories.
Pavel listened without interruption, his expression growing stormier with each revelation, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the table as if mentally filing away every incriminating detail. When Viktor finished, Pavel exhaled sharply, shaking his head in grim recognition. "It's all too clear," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "A textbook scheme, straight out of the playbook for elder exploitation. They get you declared incompetent, secure guardianship, seize control of your assets, and then conveniently relocate you to some budget nursing facility where you're out of sight and out of mind. I've seen this 100 times in my line of work, preying on isolated seniors without family to fight for them. But for your own flesh and blood to orchestrate this, your daughter of all people." Viktor surprised even himself with the defensiveness that rose in his chest. "She's not bad, you know," he interjected, his voice softening as if shielding Marina from judgment. "Marinishka's a good girl at heart. She always has been. She just doesn't know the full story. And Oleg, he's got her ear now. He's constantly feeding her these ideas that I'm a failure, a burden, dragging them down. She listens to him because he's the one beside her every day. Back when she was little, she hung on my every word. Now it's him. People change with the company they keep." Pavel shook his head again, a rueful smile tugging at his lips despite the gravity of the situation. "Vitya, you're too kind for your own good. You always were, the soft-hearted judge who saw redemption where others saw only guilt. Remember the Klimov case, that young sergeant accused of theft from the depot? Everyone was convinced he was guilty. The evidence seemed airtight. The higher-ups were pushing for a swift conviction to close the books and move on. But not you. You dug in for 3 solid months, turning over every stone until you unearthed the real culprit. You saved that kid from a prison term that would have ruined him, and then you even apologized to the brass for the delay. Apologized, as if justice should ever be rushed." Viktor did remember, vividly. Sergeant Klimov, barely 20, fresh out of basic training, his eyes wide of terror during the proceedings. The charges? Pilfering supplies from the storeroom, with fingerprints and witness statements stacking up like an unbreakable wall. But something nagged at Viktor, a loose thread in the testimony, a discrepancy in the timelines that no one else seemed to notice. He'd pursued it doggedly, interviewing overlooked witnesses, re-examining records late into the night, until the truth emerged, a setup by a corrupt quartermaster covering his own tracks. Klimov's mother had shown up at his office afterwards, tears streaming down her face, bearing a homemade pie as a token of gratitude. Viktor had politely declined, uncomfortable with the praise. To him, it was simply duty fulfilled, not heroism deserving of rewards. "What do I do now?" Viktor asked, his voice steady but laced with quiet desperation. "I don't want a war with my own daughter. That would break what's left of us. But I can't just surrender everything either. It's not about the money or the apartment, really. It's about dignity, I suppose. I've lived my life with honor, head held high. I won't end it branded as some senile old fool who's outlived his usefulness."
Pavel reached into his briefcase, pulling out a leather-bound notebook and a sleek pen, his demeanor shifting seamlessly into that of the seasoned advocate. "All right, then," he said, his voice adopting the crisp, authoritative edge of a man mapping out a battlefield. "I've been practicing law for decades now, specializing in family disputes and guardianship cases just like this. They're more common than you'd think, unfortunately. But we've got options, solid paths forward." For the next hour, they delved into strategy, Pavel outlining the legal intricacies with the precision of a surgeon, potential motions to file, evidence to gather, precedents from similar cases he'd handled, where opportunistic relatives had been thwarted. Viktor listened intently, occasionally interjecting with pointed questions, jotting notes in the small pocket notebook he always carried, a relic from his military days, when every detail could mean the difference between order and chaos. The key weapon in our arsenal, Pavel concluded, tapping his pen for emphasis, is the truth about you. Their whole case hinges on painting you as a frail, forgetful old man incapable of managing his affairs. We'll shatter that illusion. Bring in your service records, your awards, character references from colleagues who knew the real Viktor Gromov. We'll line up witnesses to attest to your sharpness, your independence, your lifetime of principled decisions. The judge will see exactly who they're trying to sideline, not some doddering invalid, but a man of unyielding integrity. Viktor hesitated, his old aversion surfacing like a reflex. "I don't want to parade my past like some trophy," he murmured. "It feels like bragging." Pavel fixed him with a steady gaze. "This isn't about ego, Vitya. It's self-defense. There's a world of difference, and right now, it's the shield you need." They parted ways around noon, the sun breaking through the clouds as if in tentative approval. Pavel promised to dive deeper into the case files and draft a robust defense plan. Viktor committed to gathering his documents from the briefcase, the commendations, the orders, the letters, and compiling a list of potential witnesses from his old network. They shook hands firmly, and Pavel pulled him into another heartfelt embrace, clapping him on the back. "We'll handle this," he assured. "Trust me, I won't let them get away with it." Viktor stepped out onto the street, the air warmer now, the city buzzing with midday energy that no longer felt quite so alienating. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he sensed a flicker of hope igniting within him, a quiet resolve that maybe, just maybe, the scales of justice could tip in his favor once more. Uncertainty? No, it wasn't that. Not a wavering doubt gnawing at the edges of his resolve. It was something purer, more fragile, a glimmer of hope that perhaps, against all odds, things might not unravel as disastrously as he dreaded in his darkest moments. That faint spark propelled him forward as he decided to walk to the old factory administration building where he'd worked after his retirement from the military. The factory had shuttered years ago, its once bustling halls silenced by economic shifts and corporate indifference. The structure had changed hands multiple times since then, evolving into a sleek business center crammed with modern offices, co-working spaces, and trendy cafes on the ground floor, their aromas of fresh brewed espresso wafting out to mingle with the crisp autumn air. Yet amid all the transformations, the security detail remained a constant, and a few of the guards had been fixtures there since the factory's heyday, loyal sentinels bridging the past and present. Viktor spotted the building from a distance, its familiar silhouette rising against the skyline like an old acquaintance. A four-story edifice of weathered red brick, punctuated by large arched windows that somehow escaped replacement over the decades, and crowned by a heavy wooden door that creaked with the weight of history. It stood as a testament to endurance, much like Viktor himself, unyielding in form even as the world around it spun into something unrecognizable. He approached with measured steps, his polished shoes clicking softly on the pavement, and through the glass partition of the lobby he caught a sight of a familiar face, Alexei Petrovich, the former factory watchman, now presumably a security guard for the business center, had aged considerably, his posture stooped from years of standing watch, his hair thinned to wisps of gray, but his eyes, those remained unchanged, sharp, vigilant, always scanning for the slightest anomaly, a habit born from decades of duty. Viktor pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the warmth of the lobby. Alexei looked up from his newspaper, his expression shifting from boredom to wide-eyed astonishment, as if a ghost had materialized before him. "Viktor Stepanovich," he uttered, his voice laced with disbelief, rising in pitch. "Is that really you, alive and kicking?" Viktor allowed himself a genuine smile, the first in what felt like an eternity, cracking the stoic mask he'd worn for so long. "Alive, Lyosha," he replied warmly, using the diminutive form of the man's name like an old comrade. "Still kicking, for now at least." Alexei sprang from his chair with surprising agility for his age, straightening his uniform shirt as if preparing for a formal inspection, his movements crisp and military-like despite the civilian setting. "Reporting for duty, sir," he exclaimed, slipping into an old habit from their shared past, perhaps echoing Viktor's own military background. "What a reunion! We still talk about you around here from time to time. Folks like you don't come along often." "What kind of folks?" Viktor asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. A quiet curiosity prompted him to hear it aloud.
Honest ones, Alexei said, simply, without embellishment, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned truth. You remember when they tried to fire me, back in '98, the crisis, the layoffs. I was at the top of the list, with a sick wife and 2 young kids depending on me. I went to the director, practically on my knees, begging to stay. He kicked me out, said no one's indispensable, told me to stop whining. Viktor did remember, the memory resurfacing like a well-preserved document from his mental archives. Alexei's dismissal had struck him as profoundly wrong, a needless cruelty in an already harsh time. So he'd marched into the director's office, not to plead or grovel, but to speak plainly, as he'd been trained, facts laid bare, logic unassailable. He'd argued the man's 20 years of loyal service, the family obligations, the moral imperative not to discard a devoted employee like yesterday's scrap metal. The director had balked at first, but Viktor had a gift for persuasion, finding the precise words, the right tone that pierced through resistance like a well-aimed verdict. You put your own job on the line, Alexei continued, his voice thickening with emotion. For me, a nobody, a stranger really. No one else would stick their neck out like that. Everyone was too scared, but not you. I still remember it clear as day. That was ages ago, Viktor murmured, waving it off modestly, uncomfortable with the spotlight. Things like that, they stick with you, Alexei countered, firmly. My wife, God rest her soul, used to light a candle for you every time she went to church, called you our guardian angel, she did. Viktor shifted awkwardly, unsure how to respond to such raw gratitude. It had always unsettled him, this outpouring of thanks for actions he viewed as mere decency, the baseline of human conduct rather than anything heroic. They chatted for another 20 minutes or so, Alexei regaling him with updates on his life, his children, now grown and scattered across cities, pursuing their own paths, his grandchildren whom he saw too infrequently but cherished through photos and video calls, his job, which wasn't glamorous but paid the bills and kept him occupied in his twilight years. Viktor listened attentively, nodding along, genuinely pleased that fate had been kind to the man after all.
Eventually, he bid farewell and stepped back into the street, the wind tousling his hair as he resumed his walk home. Twice more he was stopped, first by an elderly woman at a bus stop, her face lighting up with recognition as she clasped his hand in a surprisingly firm grip, thanking him profusely for some long-forgotten assistance he couldn't even recall. Then a middle-aged man outside a corner store who introduced himself as the son of someone Viktor had once helped with paperwork during a bureaucratic tangle. Both encounters echoed the same refrain, "Thank you. You're a good man. You helped us when no one else would." Viktor continued on, his mind swirling with the peculiar ironies of life. He'd aided these people 10, 20, even 30 years ago, not for acclaim or lasting memory, but simply because it had felt right, an extension of the justice he'd sworn to uphold in his earlier career. Yet here they were, strangers turned grateful echoes of the past, holding on to those moments with unwavering appreciation. Meanwhile, his own daughter, the one for whom he'd sacrificed his promising trajectory, his health, half a lifetime of quiet devotion, saw him as little more than a hindrance, a relic to be shuffled aside. He arrived home by lunchtime, true to the note he'd left, slipping in quietly as the apartment hummed with midday stillness. Marina was absent, likely out on one of her errands or meetings, her car gone from its usual spot. Viktor prepared a simple meal from the fridge's meager offerings, a slice of bread, some cheese, perhaps a bit of leftover soup heated on the stove, and ate at the kitchen table, savoring the solitude. Afterward, he retreated to his room, retrieving the old briefcase once more. He spread its contents across the bed, the documents, the medals, the letters, artifacts of a life he'd kept hidden. Methodically, he began sorting them, preparing for the battle ahead, steeling himself for the confrontation that loomed like an inevitable storm. That evening, Marina and Oleg returned, their voices filtering through the walls as they settled into dinner in the living room. Viktor caught snippets at first, mundane chatter about their day, work frustrations, weekend plans. But soon the conversation sharpened, turning to him, their tones rising just enough to carry. "The lawyer says it's straightforward," Oleg was saying, his voice smug and assured. We've got the doctor's certificate, statements from the neighbors, everything's airtight. In a month, we'll have the ruling and we can list the apartment for sale." "What if he doesn't go along with it?" Marina asked, a hint of unease creeping in. "He was out all day today. What if he's plotting something?" "Plotting? Come on, what could he possibly do? An old man with no money, no connections, no lawyer. He'll sulk in his room, stay quiet, and that's that. He's a coward, always has been. Never stood up to anyone his whole life." Viktor sat on the edge of his bed, the word echoing in his mind. Coward. Him. A man who'd defied the system when silence was the norm, who'd risked imprisonment for the sake of truth, who'd walked away from a stellar career to care for a dying wife and a young daughter. No anger surged through him, strangely enough, only a profound weariness, mingled with regret, not for the choices he'd made, but for the ones he hadn't, for failing to reveal his true self to Marina, for letting his silence build into an impenetrable barrier that might now be too formidable to breach. He turned in early that night, but sleep eluded him for hours. Lying in the darkness, staring at the ceiling's faint cracks, he pondered the impending court date, standing before a judge to affirm his sanity, facing his daughter across the aisle as if she were an adversary, wondering if forgiveness could bridge the chasm if she ever sought it, and if she'd even bother to ask. Behind the wall, Marina and Oleg's murmurs continued, oblivious to the man whose life they were dissecting. Their voices drifted through the wall, muffled but resolute, laced with the unshakable certainty of victors plotting their triumph. They were convinced of their win, sure that the old man wouldn't put up a fight, that in a month's time they'd claim his apartment and rid themselves of him for good. Viktor closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, knowing he needed every ounce of strength he could muster. Ahead lay a battle he hadn't sought, but one he couldn't back down from, no matter the cost. The morning of the trial dawned gray and unforgiving, a fine drizzle that had started in the night transforming the streets into glistening ribbons of wet asphalt by daybreak. Viktor stirred 2 hours before his alarm, lying motionless in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic patter of raindrops against the windowsill. The sound transported him back to his army days, canvas tents in remote field camps, sleepless nights before critical operations. Back then, he'd lie awake too, rehearsing arguments in his mind, steeling himself for the fray. But he was young and vigorous in those memories. Now, at 68, every dawn greeted him with aching knees and a heaviness in his chest that no amount of willpower could fully dispel.
He rose quietly, splashed his face with cold water, and stared long into the mirror. The reflection gazing back was that of an old man, deep furrows etched across his forehead, silver hair thinning at the temples, eyes shadowed with fatigue. It was hard to reconcile this image with the one from his prime, a face that had commanded respect, even fear, in courtrooms where defendants paled at his entrance, and lawyers prepared for weeks, knowing Judge Gromov would tolerate no oversights, no deceptions. Viktor dressed in his finest suit, the one he'd worn to his retirement ceremony 23 years ago. It was outdated in style, but it still fit him well. His frame had changed little over the decades, a testament to his disciplined life. He knotted the tie Ludmila had given him on his last birthday before her illness took hold, a deep blue with subtle silver stripes, formal and elegant. She'd said it made him look like a diplomat. He'd chuckled then, protesting that he was just a military lawyer, not an ambassador. Ludmila had shaken her head, smiling that special smile of hers, one he could still conjure vividly, warm and knowing. The kitchen was empty, a silent void. Marina and Oleg were either still asleep or pretending to be, avoiding any awkward encounters. Viktor skipped breakfast, opting only for a glass of water before slipping out, closing the door with a soft click that echoed in the hallway like a finality. At the threshold he paused, glancing back at the corridor, the closed doors to rooms that felt increasingly alien, a life where he no longer belonged. Then he donned his hat and stepped into the rain, the chills seeping through his coat like an unwelcome companion. He made his way to the courthouse by bus and then metro, though he could have called a taxi. Pavel had offered to send a car, but Viktor declined.
He needed the time, the jostle of public transit, the anonymous press of the crowd, to gather his thoughts, to reconnect with the city pulsing around him, to remind himself of who he truly was. In the subway car, he stood gripping the handrail, observing the passengers, young professionals buried in their phones, elderly folks clutching shopping bags, families herding children. A cross-section of humanity, rich and poor, joyful and weary, none of them aware that the unassuming man beside them was en route to prove to his own daughter that he wasn't mad, that his mind remained as sharp as ever. The courthouse loomed just as he remembered from his infrequent visits post-retirement, an imposing gray edifice with stately columns, broad stone steps slick with rain, and heavy doors fitted with brass handles that gleamed dully under the overcast sky. Inside, the air carried that unmistakable institutional scent, aged paper, dust, and a faint bureaucratic mustiness unique to government buildings. Viktor removed his hat, shaking off the raindrops from his coat's shoulders, and headed to the information board to confirm the courtroom number. Pavel was waiting in the second-floor corridor, right outside room 4. His friend cut a polished figure in an expensive suit, briefcase in hand, his face a mask of composed assurance. Spotting Viktor, he strode forward and clasped his hand in a firm shake. "You ready?" Pavel asked under his breath. "Ready," Viktor replied, though a sliver of doubt lingered beneath the word. "Remember what I said. No arguments, no justifications. Keep your emotions in check. You're a judge, even if retired. Act like you're on the bench."
Viktor nodded, appreciating the pep talk. It bolstered him, evoking echoes of his former authority, but it couldn't fully erase the ache. On the bench, he judged strangers with detached objectivity, their troubles distant from his heart. Today, it was family, his own blood on the other side. They settled on a bench at the corridor's end, waiting in tense silence. 10 minutes before the hour, Marina and Oleg arrived with their lawyer, a sharp young man in a trendy suit, exuding cocky self-assurance. Viktor watched them approach, their laughter echoing softly off the walls, the attorney whispering something that elicited nods and satisfied grins. Marina sported a new coat he didn't recognize, beige, expensive, with a luxurious fur collar. Bought for the occasion, no doubt, to project an image of poise and prosperity. She didn't glance his way, striding past as if he were invisible, and took a seat on the opposite bench. Oleg ignored him too, murmuring something in her ear that sparked another shared chuckle. That laughter cut deeper than any insult, a blade twisting in his gut. His daughter, marching into court to seize his last remnants of independence, treating it like a light-hearted outing rather than the betrayal it was. At precisely 10 o'clock, the clerk swung open the doors and ushered everyone inside. Viktor rose first, straightening his jacket, and walked in with purposeful strides, back ramrod straight, gait steady, eyes fixed ahead. It was how the army had drilled him, how he carried himself through life, even when his knees protested and age urged him to slump. The courtroom was modest, rows of wooden benches for spectators, tables for the parties, and an elevated judge's bench presiding over it all. Windows overlooked a drab courtyard, admitting the muted light of the stormy morning. The air smelled of polished wood and faint dust. Viktor took his place at the defendant's table beside Pavel, folding his hands in his lap and staring resolutely forward. Marina and Oleg settled across the aisle, close enough now for him to study his daughter's face. She scrolled through her phone, her expression distant and detached. Oleg conferred with their lawyer, gesturing at documents. Neither spared him a look. Minutes ticked by in anticipatory hush. Then the clerk announced the judge's entrance, calling for all to rise. Viktor stood with the others, turning toward the bench, bracing for an unfamiliar face. The judge entered briskly, adjusting his robe with practiced efficiency. A man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the weary countenance of someone who'd spent too many years unraveling others' entanglements. He ascended to his seat, opened the case file, and recited the standard opening, date, case number, parties involved, in a monotone honed by routine.
Then he looked up at the defendant, and his face blanched. Viktor watched the transformation unfold, confidence giving way to surprise, surprise to disbelief, disbelief to outright shock. He removed his glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief, replaced them, glanced at his papers, then back at Viktor. His hands, resting on the desk, began to tremble subtly. "My God," he whispered, barely audible, yet the words reverberated in the courtroom's stillness like thunder. "Viktor Stepanovich, is it really you?" Heads swiveled. Marina tore her gaze from her phone, staring at her father as if seeing him anew, etching her features confusion. Oleg frowned, bewildered by the disruption. Their lawyer froze mid-shuffle of papers, gaping at the judge in puzzlement. The judge rose slowly from his chair, a flagrant breach of protocol, and stepped to the edge of the dais. "Do you remember me?" he asked, his voice a blend of excitement and tentative hope. "Kovalev, Evgeny Kovalev, 1987. You handled my father's case." Viktor met the man's eyes, sifting through the archives of his memory. 1987. Kovalev. A faint stirring, a vague image, a face from the past began to surface, piecing itself together like fragments of a long-forgotten verdict.
Viktor paused, his mind drifting back through the haze of years, until a name surfaced like a forgotten artifact from the depths of his memory. "Sergei Ivanovich Kovalev," he said softly, his voice barely carrying across the quiet courtroom. "Senior lieutenant in the quartermaster's service, accused of embezzling military property." The judge closed his eyes for a moment, as if the words had struck a chord deep within him, and then he nodded slowly. "Yes, that's my father." He was facing 15 years in prison. Everyone said it was an open and shut case. The evidence was ironclad, the verdict inevitable. 3 other judges had already backed out, refusing to touch it, because the higher-ups were pushing for a quick conviction. They needed a scapegoat, and my father was chosen to play that role. Viktor remembered that case all too well. It had been one of the most grueling challenges of his long career in the judiciary. The documents painted Kovalev as guilty beyond doubt, ledgers showing discrepancies, inventories that didn't add up, witnesses lined up to testify against him, their stories consistent and damning. His superiors breathed Viktor's neck, demanding a swift resolution to wrap things up neatly. But something nagged at him, like a splinter under the skin. Tiny inconsistencies, overlooked details that didn't quite align, kept him awake at night. Against all advice, he dug deeper, spending 3 exhaustive months unraveling the threads, enduring the fury of his bosses and the ridicule of his colleagues. In the end, he uncovered the true perpetrator, a major from headquarters who had manipulated Kovalev as a convenient shield for his own elaborate schemes of corruption. "And you agreed to take it on?" Judge Kovalev continued, his tone laced with a mix of awe and gratitude. "You were the only one who insisted on getting to the bottom of it." He leaned forward slightly, his judicial robes seeming less imposing now, more like a cloak of shared history. "You pored over that case for 3 full months when everyone else was screaming to close it in a week. They pressured you, threatened you, even tried to pull you off the assignment, but you stood your ground. You found the real criminal, proved my father's innocence beyond any shadow of doubt. Because of you, he walked free, lived another 20 years in peace, and passed away in his own bed, not rotting away in some labor camp." The courtroom fell into a profound silence, the kind that presses in from all sides, heavy with unspoken emotions. Marina, Viktor's daughter, stared at her father with wide eyes, her face a canvas of expressions he hadn't seen there in decades. Shock, confusion, and perhaps the faint glimmer of dawning comprehension. It was as if she were seeing him not as the frail, elderly man she sought to declare incompetent, but someone entirely new, or rather, someone she had forgotten he once was. "I became a lawyer because of you," Judge Kovalev said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "After what you did for our family, I knew that's what I wanted,
to be like you, fair, honest, incorruptible. Throughout my entire career, I've strived to live up to the standard you set back in 1987. You showed me what true justice looks like, even when the world conspires against it." He fell silent for a few long seconds, his gaze locked on Viktor's, a silent exchange passing between them like an old debt finally acknowledged. Then, with a heavy sigh, he straightened up, his demeanor shifting back to formal authority. "I am recusing myself from this case," he announced in an official tone that brooked no argument. "I cannot preside over it. I have no moral right to judge a man to whom my family owes everything." Marina's lawyer, Oleg, leapt to his feet, his face flushed with indignation. "Your Honor, this is a blatant violation of procedure. You can't just—" "I can," Kovalev interrupted coldly, his eyes narrowing, "and I am. The case will be assigned to another judge. This hearing is adjourned." He gathered his papers from the bench with deliberate movements, then strode towards the exit. At the doorway, he paused and turned back, addressing the room at large but directing his words with pointed emphasis. "Do you all realize who you're trying to declare incompetent here?" His voice carried an edge of righteous anger. "Viktor Stepanovich Gromov, retired Colonel of Justice, former judge of the Western District's Military Tribunal, a legend in our field. The man who refused to condemn an innocent soul when the entire ministry was bearing down on him. A man who chose truth over everything else, while others around him chased promotions and safety." His gaze settled on Marina, hardening into something almost accusatory. "Think very carefully about what you're doing here," he said, before turning on his heel and exiting, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. For several heartbeats, the courtroom remained frozen in stunned immobility, no one daring to speak or move. Then chaos erupted, voices overlapping in a cacophony of surprise and debate. The court clerk arose, her voice cutting through the din to announce the postponement, rattling off a new date and urging everyone to clear the room. Oleg, still fuming, muttering heatedly about procedural irregularities and potential appeals. Marina's advocate paced nearby, gesturing animatedly as he argued with a colleague. Oleg himself was glued to his phone, frantically dialing contacts in a bid to salvage the situation. But Marina sat utterly still amid the turmoil, her eyes fixed on her father, as if beholding him for the very first time. There was a vulnerability in her posture, a crack in the armor of resentment she had built over the years, perhaps from misunderstandings or the slow erosion of time. As the crowd began to filter out into the corridor, people started approaching Viktor, drawn like moths to a flame of long-buried respect. First came the court secretary, an elderly woman with silver hair neatly pinned in a severe bun, her steps tentative but purposeful. "Viktor Stepanovich?" she asked hesitantly, her voice soft with uncertainty. "Forgive me for intruding, but do you remember me? My name is Solovyova. Back in 1992, you helped my husband. He served under your command, and then he was accused of exceeding his authority. You took the time to investigate properly, proved he was just following orders from his superior." Viktor nodded, the memory flickering dimly in his mind, one case among countless others that had blurred together over the decades. "My husband spoke of you to our children and grandchildren," she continued, her eyes misting over with gratitude. "He always said there are honest people in this world, and you were proof of that. He passed away 3 years ago, but he never forgot you, always mentioned you with the deepest thanks." Before Viktor could respond, another figure approached, a man in his mid-40s, dressed casually in a worn jacket and jeans, his face weathered but earnest. "Excuse me," he said, extending a hand toward Viktor. "Are you Judge Gromov, the one and only? My grandfather served alongside you back in the day. He used to tell stories about how you stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Said you saved a few good men from unjust fates."
He used to tell stories about how you refused to sign that execution order in Afghanistan, back when your commander was desperate to cover up his own blunder. "Is that true?" the man asked, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and reverence, as if unearthing a long-buried legend. Viktor didn't answer right away. It was true, every word of it. a haunting chapter from his military days that he had buried deep within himself, not out of shame, but because some memories were too raw to parade in the light of day. He certainly didn't want to dredge it up here, in the sterile corridor of the courthouse, under the watchful eyes of strangers and, more pointedly, his daughter, who stood just a few meters away, eavesdropping on every syllable with an intensity he hadn't seen in her for years. Marina was indeed lingering nearby, rooted to the spot despite Oleg's insistent tugs on her arm, his whispers urging her to leave this unexpected gathering behind. But she resisted, her gaze fixed on her father and the small crowd encircling him, faces etched with genuine respect, gratitude shining in their eyes like polished metals. She watched in silence, her expression a turbulent sea of emotions, surprise at the revelations, perhaps a flicker of pride she didn't know how to process, and an undercurrent of something deeper, more personal, that made her chest tighten. Pavel, Viktor's steadfast friend and companion through this ordeal, approached quietly and gently took him by the elbow, his touch a grounding anchor in the whirlwind of the morning. "Let's get out of here," he murmured softly, his voice laced with concern. "You need to rest after all this." Viktor nodded wearily, a subtle acknowledgement that spoke volumes. He felt utterly drained, as if some vital essence had been siphoned from his soul. The judge's unexpected confession, the parade of people with their heartfelt stories of past interventions, and now Marina's lingering gaze. It was an avalanche of emotions crashing down on him in the span of one chaotic morning, far too much for his aging heart to bear without respite. They had just begun to make their way toward the exit, navigating the thinning crowd, when a voice pierced the air from behind them. "Papa!" Viktor halted mid-step, his body tensing instinctively, but he didn't turn around immediately. The word hung in the corridor, like a fragile bridge across a chasm. "Papa, wait!" Marina called again, her tone softer, almost pleading. Slowly, deliberately, he pivoted to face her. She stood there, mere steps away, her face a complex mosaic of emotions that Viktor struggled to decipher. Vulnerability mixed with resolve, perhaps a hint of regret shadowing her features. Oleg hovered beside her, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his expression one of barely concealed annoyance, as if this interruption was an unwelcome detour in his carefully scripted day. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Marina asked, her voice hushed, trembling slightly at the edges. "About all of this, the trials, the cases you handled, the awards, the lives you changed. Why do I have to hear it all here from complete strangers?" Viktor held her gaze for what felt like an eternity, studying her face, so strikingly reminiscent of her mother's Ludmila's, with those same expressive eyes that now held, for the first time in decades, a spark of genuine curiosity about him, about the man he had been before time and distance eroded their bond. He noticed her hands fidgeting nervously with the strap of her handbag, a telltale sign of the inner turmoil she was wrestling with. "Did you ever ask?" he replied, at last, his words simple, yet weighted with the accumulated silence of years unspoken. Marina's mouth parted as if to retort, but no words came forth. She stood there, stunned, the question rebounding in her mind like an echo in an empty room. Oleg, growing impatient, grabbed her arm more firmly this time. "Come on," he snapped, his irritation bubbling over. "Enough of this circus. You can talk to him later if you really want to." Reluctantly, Marina allowed herself to be led away, her steps hesitant as they moved toward the courthouse doors. But at the threshold, she paused and turned back, casting a long, lingering look at her father. In that gaze, Viktor glimpsed a whirlwind of conflicting feelings, bewilderment at the revelations that had upended her perceptions, a twinge of shame for her part in this legal charade, and perhaps the tender shoots of something that once was unbridled daughterly affection, now tentatively reawakening after years of dormancy. Viktor watched her depart, a strange cocktail of emotions churning within him,
sharp pangs of pain from the rift that had brought them to this point, mingled with a fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, not everything was irretrievably lost between them. The new hearing was scheduled for 10 days later, a span of time that stretched out interminably, like the slow crawl of a glacier toward an inevitable confrontation. Viktor retreated into seclusion, seldom venturing beyond the confines of his modest room, except for brief forays to the kitchen for a cup of tea or to the bathroom. Marina and Oleg mirrored his avoidance, transforming the apartment into a peculiar limbo, a shared space inhabited by 3 souls who coexisted in proximity but were worlds apart, separated by invisible barriers woven from unspoken grievances, lingering resentments, and the heavy veil of things left unsaid. Yet, in the wake of that courtroom bombshell, subtle shifts began to manifest, detectable in the minutiae of daily life. Marina's laughter, once quick to erupt at Oleg's barbed quips aimed at Viktor, had vanished entirely. She grew quieter, more introspective, her movements deliberate and thoughtful. Several times, Viktor caught her stealing glances in his direction, fleeting, embarrassed looks that suggested she was on the verge of broaching a question, of bridging the gap, but each time she faltered, retreating back into her shell. Oleg, in stark contrast, seemed to amplify his discontent, his demeanor turning sharper, more abrasive with each passing hour. His conversations with Marina devolved into clipped, terse exchanges, doors slammed with unnecessary force, echoing through the apartment like punctuation marks in an argument. He took to leaving early in the mornings and returning late into the night, long after the household had surrendered to sleep, as if the very air in the home had become toxic to him. It was on the 3rd day following the hearing that Viktor inadvertently overheard their quarrel. He was lying in his room, staring at the ceiling in a futile attempt to summon sleep, when raised voices filtered through the thin walls, piercing the quiet like unwelcome intruders. At first, it was Oleg's voice dominating, harsh, laced with anger, followed by Marina's softer, more tentative responses. Viktor had no intention of eavesdropping. It felt like an invasion, but the partitions were flimsy, and the words seeped through regardless, demanding to be heard. "I don't care what that judge spouted off about," Oleg snarled, his tone dripping with dismissal. "It changes nothing. Your father is still an old man who can't take care of himself. Just because he was some hotshot judge back in the day doesn't erase the fact that now he's nothing but a burden." "Oleg, did you hear what those people said about him?" Marina countered, her voice unsteady but gaining strength. "He saved innocent lives, risked his entire career for the sake of justice, and I didn't even know any of it. How could I not know?" "That was 40 years ago, Marina. 40 years. Ancient history. Right now, he's just a senile old guy who mixes up the days of the week and forgets to turn off the gas. That's the reality we're dealing with. But maybe he's not as confused as we think. Maybe we've just never really listened to him. Maybe we haven't given him a chance to speak up for himself." A heavy pause descended, thick with unspoken implications. When Oleg spoke again, his voice had hardened into ice, unyielding and cold. "So what? You've changed your mind? You want to drop the lawsuit? Fine, go ahead. But tell me this. How are we supposed to pay the mortgage? How do we cover the car loan? And what about your treatments when the time comes? His apartment is 8 million. 8 million rubles. That's our ticket out of this debt trap, our shot at a normal life without scraping by every month." "That's my father's apartment," she whispered, her words laced with a quiet defiance. "He's lived there for 40 years. And he's not even using it properly anymore. It's sitting there empty while we're drowning in payments. Is that fair? He's alone. He doesn't need a whole separate place, but we need the money, desperately." Marina fell silent, offering no rebuttal. She could hear her soft, muffled sobs, the kind that she tried to stifle to avoid drawing attention, but they escaped nonetheless, raw and heartbreaking. Then came the sharp slam of a door, reverberating through the walls, and the apartment plunged back into an oppressive quiet. Viktor lay there in the enveloping darkness, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts as he processed what he had overheard. The revelations stung, confirming suspicions he had harbored but hoped were unfounded, the financial desperation fueling this painful charade, the fractures in his daughter's marriage, and the glimmers of doubt now seeding in her heart. It was a lot to absorb, lying alone in the shadows, but amidst the ache, that fragile hope from the courthouse corridor flickered once more, refusing to be extinguished.
Debts, mortgages, loans, it all came crashing down on Viktor like a sudden storm he hadn't seen brewing. He had been utterly oblivious to the financial turmoil engulfing Marina and Oleg. They had never breathed a word about it to him, and he, in turn, had never pried. From his vantage point, their life appeared polished and prosperous. A spacious apartment in a desirable neighborhood, a sleek new car gleaming in the driveway, weekend dinners at upscale restaurants where laughter flowed as freely as the wine. He had assumed everything was fine, that his daughter had built a stable, comfortable existence for herself. But now, the truth unraveled before him like a thread pulled from a fraying sweater. It was all an illusion, propped up by credit cards, bank loans, and borrowed time. Money they didn't have, obligations piling up like unpaid bills in a forgotten drawer. This revelation didn't excuse their actions, not by a long shot. Attempting to declare him incompetent, to seize his remaining apartment through legal maneuvering, it was a betrayal that cut deep, stirring a bitterness he struggled to suppress. Yet, in the quiet recesses of his mind, it offered a sliver of explanation, a context that humanized their desperation without absolving it. Viktor had witnessed this pattern countless times during his years on the bench. Ordinary, decent people, teachers, engineers, family men, transformed into perpetrators of fraud, theft, or worse, all because the vice of financial ruin squeezed them until morality cracked. Not out of inherent malice, but from raw fear, the kind that gnaws at the soul when bills outpace paychecks, when the specter of eviction or repossession looms like a shadow at the door. Desperation, he knew, could erode principles faster than any vice. On the 6th day after the hearing, as the interminable wait for the rescheduled court date dragged on, Pavel's call shattered the monotonous silence of Viktor's isolation. His voice crackled with urgency over the line. He had unearthed crucial documents, pieces of the puzzle that could shift the tide. They agreed to meet at the same modest cafe where their initial strategy session had unfolded, a cozy spot tucked away from the bustle of the city with worn wooden tables and the faint aroma of fresh brewed coffee mingling with the scent of pastries. Pavel arrived promptly, his face etched with a mix of triumph and solemnity, clutching a thick manila folder under his arm. He slid into the booth across from Viktor, wasting no time as he flipped open the folder and spread its contents across the table like a map to buried treasure. "Take a look at this," he said, his finger jabbing at the first document, a crisp extract from the Rosregister, Russia's Federal Registry of Real Estate. "This is the record for your old apartment, the one you shared with Ludmila and little Marina back in the day. Remember when you transferred it to her?" How could Viktor forget? It was 2010, the year Marina turned 25, a milestone he and Ludmila had marked with quiet pride. He had wanted to give her something substantial, a legacy that went beyond fleeting gifts. That apartment had been their life's work, 15 grueling years of scrimping and saving, setting aside portions of every paycheck, foregoing luxuries to secure those four walls. It represented everything they had built together, their dreams, their sacrifices, their family. And he had handed it over to Marina freely, a deed of gift executed without strings or stipulations, simply because he loved her fiercely and yearned for her to have a solid foundation, a place to call her own in an unpredictable world. "Here's the gift deed itself," Pavel continued, sliding another paper forward, a notarized document bearing Viktor's signature alongside Marina's, stamped and sealed with official finality.
You gifted her the apartment, valued at around 4 million rubles back then. No conditions, no repayments, just pure generosity." "I know," Viktor murmured, his voice steady but laced with a distant ache. "He did it myself, after all." "Hold on now, look at this," Pavel urged, his tone sharpening as he produced yet another sheet from the stack, a bank statement, its columns of figures cold and impersonal. "This is a transaction record from 3 years ago. Marina sold that apartment, fetched 6.5 million rubles. Viktor froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. Sold? He had no inkling of this. Marina had never mentioned it, not a whisper during their sporadic phone calls or rare family gatherings. In his mind, the apartment still stood as a sentinel of the past, perhaps rented out for extra income, or used as an occasional retreat, or simply held in reserve against life's uncertainties. But sold? 3 years ago? The betrayal stung anew, sharper this time, laced with the salt of unspoken secrets. "Where did the money go?" he asked hoarsely, his throat tightening as if the air had grown thick. Pavel leaned in, his expression grave. "Part of it went to settling Oleg's outstanding debts, loans he'd racked up from previous ventures gone sour. Another chunk served as the down payment on the apartment you're all living in now. The rest? Splurged on that fancy car, home renovations, maybe a vacation or two to keep up appearances. But here's the kicker. It all vanished within a year and a half. Poof, gone. And then they started borrowing again, digging themselves deeper. Their total debt now? Around 3 million rubles, give or take." Viktor sat in stunned silence, the numbers swirling in his head like accusing specters. 6.5 million rubles, the fruits of his and Ludmila's lifelong toil, the home where Marina took her first steps, where Ludmila drew her last breath in quiet dignity. Sold off without a word to him, the proceeds squandered in a blur of consumerism and poor choices. And now, with that windfall exhausted, they were circling his remaining asset, the modest apartment he'd purchased with the scraps of his savings after gifting away the first one. It felt like a cruel cycle, a theft not just of property, but memories and trust. "There's more," Pavel said, his voice dropping to a weightier timbre, as if bracing for the storm. He pulled out yet another document, this one a copy of the medical certificate attached to the lawsuit, the one purporting to declare Viktor's mental incapacity. "I've dug into the filings they submitted with the petition. This doctor's note about your supposed dementia, it's bogus, Viktor, completely fabricated." "What do you mean fabricated?" Viktor demanded, a spark of indignation flaring in his chest. "The physician who signed it, I've tracked him down. He never examined you, not once, never even laid eyes on you. I confronted him and he cracked like an eggshell, admitted that Oleg slipped him 50,000 rubles to whip up the diagnosis out of thin air. The guy's willing to testify in court if we push it. This isn't just shady, it's outright forgery of official documents, a criminal offense, plain and simple." Viktor leaned back against the booth's cushioned seat, the world tilting slightly on its axis. Forgery. His own son-in-law had bribed a doctor to concoct a false medical report, all to paint him as a doddering invalid unfit to manage his affairs. It transcended mere greed or financial panic. This was deliberate deceit, a calculated plunge into illegality that could unravel lives. "What do you want to do about it?" Pavel pressed gently, his eyes searching Viktor's face for resolve. "We could file charges, initiate a criminal investigation against Oleg, document forgery, attempted real estate fraud. He'd be looking at real prison time, no question." Viktor pondered this in the heavy quiet that followed, his mind a battlefield of conflicting visions. He imagined the scene. Police at the door, Oleg in handcuffs, his defiant glare giving way to panic as he's led away. Marina's sobs echoing through the apartment, her world shattering. The trial that would ensue, headlines splashed across local papers, whispers in social circles, the indelible stain of scandal on their family name. And the worst of all, the look in Marina's eyes, not gratitude for justice served, but raw hatred, blaming him for destroying her marriage, her life. "No," Viktor said at last, his decision crystallizing with quiet finality. "No criminal proceedings. We'll handle this through the civil suit alone. I want to win fair and square." "Vitya, come on," Pavel protested, using the affectionate diminutive that harkened back to their shared youth. "They tried to rob you blind, faked evidence to do it. This isn't a game, it's serious." "I know," Viktor replied, his voice firm yet weary. "But Marina, she's my daughter. If Oleg ends up behind bars because of me, she'll never forgive it. Our bond, whatever fragile threads remain, would snap forever. I don't want a victory that costs me everything. No prisons, no public spectacles. I need her to see the truth for herself, to understand without the hammer of the law forcing it upon her."
Pavel shook his head slowly, a mixture of resignation and understanding etched on his weathered face, but he didn't press the argument further. He knew Viktor far too intimately. Decades of friendship had taught him that when it came to matters of principle, his old comrade was as unyielding as a granite cliff battered by relentless waves. Trying to sway him would be futile, like arguing with the tide. "All right then," Pavel conceded with a sigh, folding the documents back into the folder with careful precision. "We'll play it your way, but we'll wield this information like a trump card in court. We'll present the certificate to the judge and dismantle it piece by piece, proving it's nothing but a forgery. That alone should bury their lawsuit 6 feet under, expose the whole scheme for the sham it is." The morning of the rescheduled hearing dawned bright and unseasonably sunny, as if nature itself had conspired to offer a counterpoint to the gloom that had shrouded the previous session. Golden rays pierced the crisp air, casting long shadows across the awakening city streets, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of blooming lilacs from nearby parks. Viktor rose early, methodically donning his best suit, the one he reserved for occasions that demanded dignity and resolve. He adjusted the tie that had once belonged to Ludmila, its subtle pattern of navy and silver a quiet talisman of her enduring presence, a thread connecting him to the life they had shared. Stepping out of the apartment well before the appointed hour, he chose to walk to the courthouse rather than take a taxi or bus. The stroll allowed him to breathe in the fresh air, feel the pavement solid beneath his feet, and gather his thoughts like scattered pages of a well-worn book. Each step was a meditation, a preparation for the confrontation ahead, where truths long buried would be laid bare under the harsh light of justice. The new judge assigned to the case was a woman in her mid-50s, with sharp features framed by a no-nonsense bob of salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses that perched on the bridge of her nose like a sentinel. She exuded an air of strict efficiency, her movements precise and economical as she entered the courtroom exactly on time, her black robes swirling briefly before she settled into her seat at the bench. There were no preambled pleasantries, no wasted words or ceremonial flourishes. She dove straight into the proceedings with the focus of someone who viewed time as a precious commodity not to be squandered on frivolities. Viktor found himself admiring her immediately. In his own judicial days, he had always held in high regard those who cut through the chaff to reach the wheat of the matter at hand. Marina and Oleg's attorney took the floor first, his voice smooth and assured, laced with the polished cadence of someone accustomed to swaying opinions in stuffy courtrooms. He laid out their case with meticulous detail, painting a portrait of Viktor as a frail, diminishing elder whose grasp on reality had slipped irretrievably. He cited the medical certificate as ironclad evidence of dementia, quoted snippets from neighbors' affidavits describing moments of apparent confusion, forgotten conversations, misplaced items, the occasional disorientation with dates or routines. It all sounded compelling, almost irrefutable, if one didn't know the undercurrents of deception swirling beneath the surface. The lawyer's delivery was a masterclass in persuasion, his gestures measured, his tone sympathetic yet firm, as if he were merely advocating for the greater good. Then it was Pavel's turn.
He rose with a calm composure that belied the gravity of what he was about to unleash, his presence steady and unhurried. "Your Honor," he began, his voice even and resonant, carrying through the room without needing to be raised. "Before we proceed any further, I would like to submit several documents that shed considerable light on the true nature of these proceedings." He reached into his briefcase and extracted a thick folder, its contents organized with the precision of a seasoned litigator. "First and foremost, allow me to properly introduce the respondent, Viktor Stepanovich Gromov, born in 1956, retired Colonel of Justice and former judge of the Western District's Military Tribunal from 1978 to 1995. During his tenure, he presided over 357 cases, not a single verdict overturned on appeal, not one complaint upheld as valid." Pavel placed a stack of yellowed but impeccably preserved documents on the bench, their edges slightly frayed from years, but their authority undiminished. "Here is his service record: 3 commendations from the Ministry of Defense, an order for exemplary service, and a recommendation for promotion to chairman of the district's military court, a position he declined in 1995. The judge accepted the papers, her eyes scanning them with keen interest, her expression shifting from neutral detachment to subtle intrigue. Marina sat frozen in her seat, her eyes widening as she stared at her father, as if piecing together fragments of a puzzle she had long dismissed as incomplete. Beside her, Oleg fidgeted, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the wooden table, a telltale sign of mounting unease. "Why did he turn down the promotion?" the judge inquired, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel, direct and probing. "Because in that same year, his wife was diagnosed with cancer," Pavel replied without hesitation, his tone respectful yet unflinching. Viktor Stepanovich resigned his post to devote himself entirely to her care. He tended to her for 8 long years, until her passing in 2003, every single day, without nurses or aides, handling it all on his own. Pavel paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle, then glanced meaningfully at Marina. After her death, he took a modest job as a legal consultant at a local factory, all to remain close to his daughter, who was just 14 at the time. Another deliberate pause, this one heavier, as Pavel's gaze lingered on Marina. He never spoke of his illustrious past to her, dismissed it as boastful vanity. He believed that love isn't measured by medals or titles, so she grew up viewing him as an ordinary office clerk, a man who hadn't amounted to much in the grand scheme of things, a failure in her eyes. Marina averted her gaze, her cheeks flushing with crimson spots that betrayed a storm of inner conflict, shame, perhaps, mingled with the dawning realization of how profoundly she had misjudged him. "Now, regarding the apartment in question," Pavel continued, seamlessly transitioning as he produced another sheaf of papers from his arsenal, "the petitioners claim this action is for the respondent's own benefit, to ensure his well-being. Let's examine the facts." He laid out the documents with deliberate emphasis. "This is an extract from the Rose Register, the apartment at 15 Lenin Street, Unit 42, acquired by Viktor Stepanovich Gromov in 1988. In 2010, it was gifted outright to his daughter, Marina Viktorovna, on the occasion of her 25th birthday." The judge's eyebrows arched in surprise, a rare crack in her stoic facade. The respondent gifted the property to the petitioner? Precisely, an apartment valued at approximately 4 million rubles at the time, transferred without compensation, without conditions, purely because he wanted his daughter to have a secure home of her own. He placed yet another document on the bench. "And here is a bank statement confirming that 3 years ago, the petitioner sold that very apartment for 6.5 million rubles. The proceeds were depleted within 18 months, used to pay off loans, purchase a new car, and fund renovations on their current residence." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a subtle undercurrent of astonishment and judgment from the sparse audience of clerks and observers. Marina and Oleg's lawyer paled visibly, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist under the sun's glare. Thus, Pavel pressed on, his voice gaining momentum, the petitioners have already received from the respondent an asset worth over 6 million rubles. They sold it, exhausted the funds, and now seek to declare him incompetent in order to gain control of his second apartment, the only one he acquired with the remnants of his savings after selflessly giving away the first. Marina buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs, the facade of her resolution crumbling under the onslaught of exposed truths. And finally, Pavel extracted the pièce de résistance from his folder. As for the medical certificate submitted by the petitioners as proof of the respondent's incapacity, I took the liberty to contact the signing physician. He has admitted that he never examined Viktor Stepanovich. The document was issued in exchange for a payment of 50,000 rubles provided by one of the petitioners. The judge's brow furrowed deeply, her expression darkening with disapproval. That's a grave allegation. Do you have substantiation? Absolutely. The doctor is prepared to testify under oath. Additionally, I have a recorded phone conversation in which he confesses to the forgery. He proffered the evidence, a digital transcript and audio file reference, ready for review. Oleg bolted to his feet, his face contorted in fury. This is a lie, a setup. They've fabricated all of this. Petitioner, sit down, the judge commanded icily, her voice a whip crack of authority. One more outburst like that, and I'll have you removed from the courtroom. Oleg slumped back into his chair, shooting Viktor a venomous glare that could have curdled milk. Marina remained hunched over, her hands shielding her face, her body racked with silent weeping, a picture of utter devastation. "Does the defense have anything further?" the judge inquired, her tone signaling the proceedings were nearing a pivotal turn. "Almost," Pavel responded, a hint of finality in his voice as he prepared to deliver the closing blows.
He cleared his throat discreetly, signaling the end of his initial presentation. But there was one more layer to peel back in this intricate web of revelations. "If I may, Your Honor," Pavel said, his voice measured and respectful, "I would like to pose a single question to the petitioner." The judge nodded curtly, her expression impassive yet attentive, granting permission without a word. Pavel turned slowly toward Marina, his gaze steady but not accusatory, as if he were merely seeking clarity amid the emotional storm that had engulfed the courtroom. "Marina Viktorovna," he began, addressing her formally to underscore the gravity of the moment, "did you know, prior to today, who your father truly was? Were you aware of his distinguished service, his commendations and awards, the countless individuals he shielded from unjust convictions and the shadows of wrongful imprisonment?" Marina lowered her hands gradually, revealing a face streaked with the raw evidence of her turmoil, cheeks glistening with fresh tears, eyes reddened and swollen from the unrelenting flow. She lifted her gaze to meet her father's across the expanse of the courtroom. Viktor sat there, his posture ramrod straight, his features a mask of stoic neutrality, betraying no flicker of the complex emotions churning beneath the surface. No triumph, no bitterness, just an unreadable calm forged from years of presiding over human frailties. "No," she rasped, her voice hoarse and fractured, barely rising above a whisper in the hushed room. "I didn't know. He never told me." She paused, swallowing hard as if the words were lodged in her throat like jagged stones. "Why do you think that is?" The question hung in the air, a gentle prompt that invited introspection rather than confrontation. Marina remained silent for what felt like an eternity, her lips trembling as the weight of realization pressed down upon her. Then, in a voice so faint it was almost a breath, she murmured, "Because I never asked." The admission seemed to unlock a floodgate within her. "In all these years, not once did I ask him about his past, his work, about Mom. Not a single time." Her composure shattered anew, and she began to weep openly, no longer attempting to conceal the sobs that racked her slender frame, her shoulders heaving with the force of pent-up regret. "Papa," she cried out, her eyes locking onto Viktor's with desperate intensity. "Papa, please forgive me." The plea echoed through the courtroom, raw and unfiltered, a daughter's heartfelt cry piercing the formal veneer of the proceedings.
Viktor held her gaze, taking in the sight of her, her face contorted in anguish and remorse, tears cascading freely down her cheeks, her hands outstretched across the divide of the room, as if to bridge the years of estrangement. Inside him, something rigid and icy, a barrier built from months of quiet hurt and disillusionment, began to thaw slowly, like frost yielding to the first tentative warmth of spring. It wasn't forgiveness just yet, but the beginnings of a melt, a softening that hinted at the possibility of reconciliation. The judge cleared her throat pointedly, breaking the charged silence that had enveloped the room. "The court requires time to deliberate and render a decision," she announced in her crisp, authoritative tone. "We will adjourn for a 30-minute recess." She struck the gavel with a sharp rap, the sound reverberating like a punctuation mark on the emotional crescendo. 30 minutes, an interlude that stretched into what felt like an endless void, time dilating under the weight of unresolved tensions. Viktor rose from his seat and made his way out of the courtroom, his steps measured but weary, seeking the relative solace of the corridor. He lowered himself onto a wooden bench lining the wall, feeling the insistent ache in his legs and the dull throb in his back, remnants of the morning's strain. Pavel joined him silently, settling beside his old friend without uttering a word. He understood intuitively that in moments like these, companionship didn't require dialogue. Sometimes the quiet presence of a trusted ally spoke volumes more than any platitudes or reassurances ever could. Marina emerged from the courtroom shortly after, her movements hesitant, as if the revelations had stripped away her usual poise. Oleg was at her side, his grip firm on her arm as he tried to steer her away, murmuring urgently into her ear in a low hiss, words of strategy or escape perhaps, laced with frustration. But she wrenched free with surprising resolution, planting herself in the middle of the corridor, looking utterly adrift and vulnerable, like a lost child navigating an unfamiliar labyrinth. Her lawyer hovered in a distant corner, pacing back and forth with agitated energy, his phone pressed to his ear as he engaged in what appeared to be a hotly contested conversation, no doubt scrambling to salvage the remnants of their crumbling case. Viktor observed his daughter from his vantage point on the bench, his mind wandering through the labyrinthine paths of memory. Life had a peculiar way of twisting unexpectedly, he mused, a tapestry woven from choices and circumstances that often defied prediction. He had raised Marina single-handedly after Ludmila's death, those long nights of tending to fevers and nightmares, the patient hours spent over homework at the kitchen table, the proud walk beside her at her graduation ceremony. He had given her everything he possessed, his time, his resources, his unwavering love, and yet somewhere along the journey, he had lost her. The shift was insidious, not noticed in the moment, like a gradual drift apart on separate currents. She had grown into a stranger, and he couldn't pinpoint the exact instant when the bond had frayed, or the reasons why fate had allowed it to happen.
Oleg approached Marina again, this time with a gentler touch, clasping her hand in what might have passed for tenderness. "Let's just go home," he said softly, though his voice carried clearly enough for Viktor to overhear in the quiet corridor. "The case is lost. There's no point in sticking around. We'll figure out another way to handle the finances. Maybe refinance the loans, sell the car?" Marina turned to him, her eyes wide with a fresh clarity, as if she were truly seeing him for the first time, stripped of illusions. "Another way?" she echoed, her tone laced with disbelief and a rising edge of accusation. "Oleg, did you hear what was said in there? My father gave me that apartment, the only thing he had left after a lifetime of sacrifice, and I sold it without even telling him, without so much as a thank you." "It was your right," Oleg countered defensively, his voice dropping to a whisper, though the corridor's acoustics betrayed him. "He gifted it to you. That made it yours to do with as you pleased." "Your right?" Marina repeated, her voice escalating now, drawing curious glances from passers-by in the hallway, a clerk pausing mid-stride, a couple of onlookers turning their heads. "He spent 8 years caring for my dying mother, turned down a prestigious career advancement for our family's sake,
risked everything to save innocent people when everyone else turned a blind eye. And I was ready to have him declared insane, to toss him out like yesterday's trash? Is that my right?" Oleg winced, glancing around furtively to gauge if their exchange was attracting undue attention. "Keep it down," he urged through gritted teeth. "Don't make a scene here." "A scene?" Marina let out a bitter, mirthless laugh that echoed off the sterile walls. "I made a scene when I dragged my own father into court, when I let you convince me he was a burden, a failure, when I stood by while you forged that medical certificate declaring him incompetent." Oleg's face drained of color, his eyes widening in alarm. "I didn't forge anything," he protested, his denial sharp but unconvincing. "That's a lie. They're twisting it." "The doctor testified, Oleg," Marina shot back, her voice steady now, fueled by a newfound resolve. "Under oath, you paid him 50,000 rubles for a fabricated diagnosis. That's not just unethical, it's a criminal offense." A profound silence descended, thick and oppressive, as Oleg's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, searching for a rebuttal that refused to materialize. His expression cycled through a gamut of emotions, fury twisting his features, then a flash of fear, before settling back into defiant anger. "I did it for us," he finally spat out, his tone laced with justification. "We're drowning in debt, Marina. I was just trying to find a way out." "A way out at my father's expense?" she retorted, her words cutting like a blade. "At the cost of a man who's never done you any wrong? He gets in the way of our life, sitting quietly in his room, looking at us with those eyes, just breathing? I can't do this anymore." Marina took a deliberate step back, her gaze fixed on her husband with a mixture of disillusionment and sorrow, as if the veil had lifted to reveal a stranger in familiar skin. "Breathing," Marina whispered, repeating the word like an indictment, letting it hang between them as the full weight of their fractured reality settled in. "My father bothers you just by breathing," Marina repeated softly, her voice laced with a quiet fury that had been building like a storm on the horizon. With deliberate slowness, she slipped her wedding ring off her finger, the simple gold band that had once symbolized their vows, and placed it gently into Oleg's open palm. The metal caught the fluorescent light of the corridor, glinting coldly as if mocking the warmth that it once represented. "I'm filing for divorce," she stated calmly, her tone steady by the tremor in her hands. "I don't need to come home. I'll gather your things today and have them sent to you, wherever you decide to go." Oleg stared down at the ring nestled in his hand, his expression a mosaic of disbelief and dawning horror, as if the world had tilted off its axis without warning. His fingers curled around it instinctively, but his mind seemed frozen, struggling to process the abrupt severance. "You're choosing him?" he finally managed, his voice cracking with incredulity. "That old man? Over us? Over everything we've built?" "I'm choosing my father," Marina replied, her words firm and unyielding, carrying the weight of a decision long overdue. For the first time in years, a sneer twisted Oleg's features, a flash of raw contempt that he quickly masked, but not before it revealed the ugliness beneath his facade. He clenched the ring in his fist, his knuckles whitening, and turned on his heel, striding toward the exit with purposeful steps, his shoulders rigid with suppressed rage. He didn't glance back, not once, as if erasing the scene from his reality. Their lawyer hurried after him, fumbling to stuff scattered documents into his briefcase on the move, his face flushed with the awkwardness of witnessing such a personal implosion.
Marina watched them disappear around the corner, her gaze lingering on the empty space they left behind, a void that echoed with the finality of their departure. Then, slowly, she turned toward the bench where her father sat, his figure still and composed amid the corridor's subdued bustle. Viktor remained motionless, having seen and heard every exchange from his vantage point, yet unsure how to navigate the torrent of emotions surging within him,
elation at the rift's exposure, a profound relief that washed over him like a cleansing rain, or perhaps that peculiar emptiness that follows the end of a protracted battle, leaving one hollowed out and adrift. Marina took a few tentative steps toward him, then halted, hesitation etched in her posture, as if an invisible barrier held her back. "Papa," she said, her voice faltering, cracking under the strain of unspoken regrets. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've hurt you, deeply, irreparably. But if you'll allow me, if you'll give me a chance—" Her words trailed off, unfinished, as fresh tears welled up and spilled over, tracing familiar paths down her cheeks. Viktor rose from the bench with measured effort, his knees protesting with a sharp ache, his back throbbing from the morning's tensions, but he forced himself to stand tall, as he always had in moments that demanded resilience. He regarded his daughter, the wetness on her face from ceaseless crying, her lips quivering with vulnerability, her eyes brimming with a potent mix of pain and tentative hope, and in that instant he saw not the estranged woman before him, but little Marinka, the child who used to run to him after a nightmare, begging him to sit by her bed until sleep reclaimed her. "Marinka," he murmured softly, his voice a gentle anchor in the storm. "Come here." The invitation was all she needed. She rushed forward, enveloping him in an embrace so fierce it harkened back to the unreserved hugs of her youth, her arms wrapping around him with a desperation born of lost time. Viktor felt her body tremble against his, heard her muffled sobs against his chest, sensed the warm dampness of her tears soaking through his shirt. In that moment, he understood with crystalline clarity that this reconnection, this raw vulnerability, was worth more than any judicial verdict, more than the apartment, the money, or even the abstract ideal of justice. His daughter had returned to him, finally, truly returned. The courtroom doors swung open then, and the clerk's voice cut through the air, summoning everyone back for the announcement of the decision. Viktor gently disentangled himself from the hug, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a handkerchief. He pressed it into her hand. "Wipe your tears," he said softly, a hint of his old authoritative warmth returning. "It's not fitting to cry in court." Marina managed a faint smile through her sniffles, taking the cloth and dabbing at her eyes. Viktor noted, with a pang of nostalgia, that it was the very handkerchief Ludmila had embroidered for him on their wedding anniversary, pristine white, with his initials delicately stitched in the corner. He had carried it for 30 years, a talisman of their shared life, never once using it, preserving it as a sacred memento. Now, without a second thought, he had given it to their daughter. They re-entered the courtroom side by side, taking seats together for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Oleg's lawyer was conspicuously absent, having evidently fled with his client in the wake of the corridor's drama. Pavel resumed his position on Viktor's other side, offering a subtle nod of approval upon seeing father and daughter united, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The judge entered with her customary efficiency, settling behind the bench and opening the folder containing her ruling. In the matter of declaring citizen Gromov, Viktor Stepanovich, incompetent, she began in her formal, unwavering tone, her words echoing with the gravity of officialdom. The court has reviewed the submitted evidence and heard the testimonies from both parties. Based on the deliberations, the court rules as follows. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the assembled few, ensuring her words landed with full impact. "The petition is denied in its entirety," she declared. "The court finds no grounds to deem the respondent incompetent. The medical certificate presented by the petitioners is hereby invalidated due to substantiated evidence of forgery." Marina flinched at the words, a visible shudder rippling through her, but she remained silent, her hand instinctively seeking her father's for support. Viktor placed his palm reassuringly on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity.
Furthermore, the judge continued, her voice gaining a note of solemn respect, in addition, the court acknowledges the respondent's impeccable reputation, as corroborated by the provided documentation and witness statements. Viktor Stepanovich Gromov is a distinguished jurist who has dedicated his life to upholding the law and justice. She closed the folder with a definitive snap and fixed her eyes on Viktor. The court expresses profound regret that an individual of such exemplary biography was compelled to defend himself against baseless allegations from his own family. This ruling takes effect immediately. The hearing is adjourned. Viktor inclined his head in acknowledgement and stood, the weight of vindication settling over him like a well-earned cloak. Pavel clasped his hand firmly, his grin broad and genuine. "Congratulations, Vitya," he said warmly. "Justice has prevailed, as it should." "Thank you, Pasha, for everything," Viktor replied, his voice thick with gratitude, the bond of their friendship reaffirmed in that simple exchange. The trio exited the courtroom together, Viktor, Pavel, and Marina, stepping into the corridor where a small gathering awaited. It was the same faces from the previous hearing, the elderly woman whose husband had served under Viktor, the middle-aged man whose grandfather had spoken of Judge Gromov in reverent tones, and a few others Viktor didn't recognize, but who clearly knew him by reputation. They approached one by one, extending handshakes and murmured words of thanks, their eyes alight with admiration. Viktor nodded graciously, responding with modest acknowledgments, but his thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on his daughter standing beside him, witnessing for the first time the legacy his father had quietly built. On the courthouse steps, Pavel bid them farewell, citing pressing matters that demanded his attention. "Call me if you need anything," he said, pulling him into a brief, heartfelt embrace. "And don't disappear for another 20 years, all right?" "Deal," Viktor agreed, the word carrying the solemnity of a vow renewed. Left alone on the steps, Viktor and Marina stood in the October sunshine, which beamed unusually warm for the season, casting a golden hue over the bustling city below. The streets teemed with hurried pedestrians and honking cars, the sky a vast expanse of unmarred blue, and for the first time in ages, the urban sprawl felt less antagonistic, more like a familiar backdrop to a new chapter. Viktor gazed out at it all, a profound calm settling over him. It was over, not as he had feared, nor precisely as he had hoped, but concluded nonetheless. "Papa?" Marina ventured quietly, breaking the silence. "Where are you headed now?" He considered for a moment. "Home, to my apartment." "Can I come with you?" she asked tentatively. We need to talk about so much." He turned to her, taking in her face, still flushed from crying but composed now, her eyes weary yet hopeful, her hands fidgeting with her handbag strap, a nervous habit from her childhood that tugged at his heartstrings. "Let's go," he said simply. They hailed a taxi, and Marina insisted on paying, despite Viktor's mild protests, murmuring that it was the least she could do. He didn't argue, sensing her need to make even small amends. The ride passed in companionable quiet, the city's rhythm a soothing hum outside the windows. Upon arrival, the apartment greeted it with a hush of neglect and the faint mustiness of dust accumulated over months of absence, since Viktor had moved in with her. A thin gray film coated the shelves, and the plants on the windowsill had withered from forgotten watering. Yet the walls felt welcoming, the air familiar, and the light streaming through the window illuminated the corner where Ludmila's favorite armchair still stood, a silent sentinel of memories. "Nothing's changed here," Marina observed, glancing around with a touch of wonder. "It's like time stood still." "I don't care much for changes," Viktor replied, a faint smile creasing his face. "At my age, it's comforting to have something constant." He made his way to the kitchen, setting the kettle on the stove with the ease of long habit. The ritual grounded him, retrieving the cups from the cabinet, measuring out the loose tea leaves, waiting for the water to reach a rolling boil. He had performed this countless times, finding solace in its simplicity amid life's complexities. Marina settled at the table,
watching him in silence, her eyes following his every move as if rediscovering him through these everyday actions. Viktor felt her scrutiny, but didn't turn, granting her the space to gather her thoughts, to find the words that had eluded them for so long.
"Papa," she said at last, her voice breaking the quiet as he placed the steaming cup before her, the aroma of fresh tea wafting gently between them. "Tell me about Mom, about your life together, about everything I don't know." Her words hung in the air, tentative yet earnest, a bridge extended across the chasm of years unspoken. Viktor settled into the chair across from her, wrapping his hands around his own cup, drawing warmth from the porcelain as if it could steady the flood of memories threatening to overwhelm him. He sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze distant, unsure where to begin. So many years of quiet restraint, so many words left unsaid. How could he condense a lifetime into a single conversation? The weight of it all pressed on him, but he drew a deep breath and started slowly, his voice measured, laced with the patina of time. "We met in 1975, he began, the words emerging like relics unearthed from a forgotten chest. "I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of the military academy's law faculty, still green and full of ideals. Her name was Ludmila, Lucia, as everyone called her. She worked as a librarian in the garrison library." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, softening the lines etched by age. "I went in looking for a book on criminal law, something dry and procedural to prepare for my duties, but I left with her phone number instead. I have no idea where I found the courage to ask. I was terribly shy back then, awkward around women. But she smiled at me in a way that made my heart skip, and I knew if I didn't try, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." Marina listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on him, absorbing every detail, as if quenching a thirst she hadn't realized she had. Emboldened by her attentiveness, Viktor continued, the stories flowing more freely now, dredging up moments he hadn't revisited in years. He spoke of their first date in a modest park, strolling hand in hand under blooming linden trees, sharing dreams and laughter amid the simplicity of youth. Their wedding followed in a small garrison club, nothing extravagant, just close friends, a borrowed dress for Lucia, and vows exchanged with the sincerity that only young love can muster. Then came the nomadic years, constant relocations from one military posting to another, cramped apartments in remote towns where the winters were harsh and the summers fleeting. Yet in those tight spaces they built a world of contentment, turning makeshift homes into havens with little more than love and determination. He recounted the birth of Marina in a stark military hospital, his voice thickening with emotion as he described pacing the sterile corridors, his mind a whirlwind of anxiety until he heard her first cry, a sound that reshaped his universe. "And then, in 1978, they offered me the position as a judge," he went on, his tone shifting to one of quiet pride, mixed with reflection. "It was a great honor for such a young officer. Lucia was so proud of me. She always was, even when I took stands that made others turn away." "What kinds of stands?" Marina asked softly, leaning forward, her curiosity piqued. "The right ones," Viktor replied, taking a sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through him like a balm. "But not always the popular ones. Military courts in those days were treacherous ground. Pressure came from above, demands for verdicts that suited the brass, not necessarily justice. I refused to bend. I'd pore over every case, scrutinizing documents down to the last scribble, hunting for the truth, even when everyone around me wanted it buried." He paused, his eyes distant. "Like that Kovalev case, the father of the judge we met, and dozens of more like it. I couldn't condemn an innocent man. It went against everything in me, physically and morally. Lucia used to say it was my cross to bear, and my greatest blessing." He fell silent for a moment, staring out the window at the fading afternoon light, the city beyond a blur of muted colors. In 1995, they diagnosed her with cancer, stage 3. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 2 at best. I resigned that very day,
no hesitation. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" Marina whispered, her voice laced with regret, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Viktor met her gaze steadily, his expression tender, yet unflinching. "Would you have heard me? You were a teenager then, caught up in your own world, school, friends, the turbulence of growing up. Later, as a student, as a young woman building your life, you had your own struggles, joys, ambitions. I didn't want to burden you with the past. I thought love didn't need explanations, that you'd just know who I was deep down. But you didn't, because I never showed you."
"I should have asked," Marina admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush of self-reproach. "In 30 years, I never once inquired about your work, your youth, anything meaningful. I took it for granted that you were just Papa, always there, always ready to help, someone I could overlook because you'd never leave." Fresh tears welled up, spilling over in quiet, hopeless sobs. "And then Oleg came along and I started seeing you through his eyes. He called you a failure, and I believed him. Said you were a burden and I nodded along because it was easier. Easier than thinking for myself, easier than arguing with my husband, easier than admitting I was a terrible daughter." Viktor reached across the table, his hand enveloping hers in a gentle, reassuring grip, the calluses from years of life rough against her skin. "You're not a terrible daughter," he said firmly. "You're a confused one who's lost her way. That's a world apart." "I wanted to send you to a nursing home, Papa," she confessed, her voice breaking. "To a nursing home, like you were some object to be stored away." "But you didn't," he countered softly. "In the end, you chose right. That matters." "It doesn't erase the guilt," she whispered. "No, it doesn't," Viktor agreed. "But it's a start, a beginning for something new." They lingered at the kitchen table until the evening shadows lengthened across the room, the hours slipping by in a tapestry of shared stories. Viktor delved deeper into his past, recounting the cases that had defined his career, the moral dilemmas, the victories hard won against systemic pressures, the quiet satisfactions of justice served. He rose at one point to fetch old photo albums from a dusty cabinet, their pages yellowed but vibrant with captured moments. There he was, young and uniformed, standing proudly beside Ludmila on their wedding day. Another showed a tiny bundle in his arms, Marina as a newborn, her face scrunched in innocent wonder. Family outings to a friend's dacha, the three of them tanned and beaming under a summer sun. And Ludmila in her later years, still radiant before the illness stole her vitality. Marina absorbed it all, laughing at the anecdotes of youthful mishaps, weeping over the tales of loss, asking questions she should have posed 2 decades earlier. With each revelation, each shared laugh and tear, the invisible wall that had divided them crumbled further until it dissolved entirely, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection of family rediscovered. As midnight approached, Marina reluctantly gathered her things. "I need to sort out Oleg's belongings," she said, a note of resolve in her voice, "and start the divorce proceedings. It won't be quick, but I'll manage." "You could stay here," Viktor offered gently, "until things settle." She shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "No, Papa, you need your space, and so do I, but I'll come by every day if you'll let me." "I'd like that," he replied. "Always." He walked her to the door, watching as she descended the stairs until she vanished around the bend. Returning to the kitchen, he washed the cups methodically and returned the albums to their shelf. The apartment fell quiet once more, but this silence was different, no longer echoing with emptiness, but infused with a nascent warmth, a promise of renewal, perhaps even hope for what lay ahead. Viktor moved to the window, gazing out at the nocturnal cityscape. Streetlights cast pools of amber glow, sporadic cars whispered along the roads, and in the distance, a train's low rumble pierced the night. An ordinary evening in an ordinary city, yet for him it pulsed with significance. He slipped a hand into his pocket, retrieving the faded photograph of Ludmila that he had carried like a talisman all these years. "Lucia," he murmured softly into the stillness. "You were right, Marinka. Marina needed to know. I stayed silent too long and nearly lost her forever, but things will be different now. I promise." He tucked the photo away,
switched off the light, and retired to bed. For the first time in months, sleep claimed him swiftly, unburdened by nagging worries or fears. And for the first time in years, he dreamed of Ludmila, young and vibrant, her smile radiant as she whispered, "You did everything right, Vitya. I'm so proud of you." A week later, Marina arrived at his door with a large bag brimming with groceries and an offer to cook dinner together. They stood side by side in the kitchen where Ludmila once reigned, chopping vegetables amid the clatter of knives and the sizzle of pans, conversing freely about the past's echoes, the future's possibilities, the simple joys of the present. Outside, darkness gathered, but within, the light burned warm and inviting, a beacon of home reclaimed. Viktor knew this was merely the beginning, a new chapter in his life, one he would author alongside his daughter, page by page. Dear friends, you've just finished listening to a story about how silence nearly shattered a family and how it's never too late to start speaking up. It's a tale of a man who spent his life defending others but struggled to defend himself, and of a daughter who almost lost her father because she forgot to ask who he truly was. This could happen in any family. Right now, somewhere, an elderly person might be waiting for their children to call and ask how their day went. Maybe some of you haven't had a real conversation with your parents in ages, not about mundane chores, but about life, the past, the things that truly matter. If that's you, please, pick up the phone today. Don't wait for tomorrow. It might never come. If this story touched you, made you reflect, or inspired you to want more like it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Maybe you have a similar story from your own life. Share it. We'll read every one. Thank you for staying with us to the end, for your time and attention. Cherish your loved ones, and don't forget to tell them how much you love them. See you in the next story.